Welcome to the Stray Pointers podcast, where seemingly ordinary people join us for extraordinary discussions. You're watching Season 3, Episode 4 of the Stray Pointers podcast. This episode was recorded on February 17th, 2025. I'm your host, Jim Lawless. For more information about the show, including show notes for this episode, please visit straypointers.com. Tonight, software engineer and musician Gunnar Gustafson rejoins the show. Gunnar, welcome back.
Good to be back, Jim. How are you doing?
Good.
Excellent.
Gunnar, last time you were on the show, we talked about your evolution as a software engineer, and you had more than hinted that you had a musical background, and there were some parallels between the two. So tonight, why don't we talk a little bit about your history with music? I understand you've got some family history with electronic music. So however you'd like to start, go ahead and kick it off.
Yeah. Well, it's the very first engineer in my life was my grandfather, Gilbert Strubel. He was my mom's dad, Grandpa Gil. And I always have remembered, I have memories of my mom telling me, "Oh, your grandpa, he was an inventor. He invented things." And that was my early impression. I didn't know what an engineer was as a child, right? You don't know what the concepts of engineering are. It's kind of difficult to grasp that as a concept. So, yeah, she just said, "Oh, he invented things." And later on in life, I actually found out that he was an engineer at RCA. He started his career in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He actually worked on the completion of the Panama Canal during World War II, which he wasn't very happy about. I think he wanted to actually go out and fight people. But they put a lot of engineering into the completion of the canal just to get the supply chain going through to Europe. And I remember corresponding with him a lot as a younger man. He would tell me stories about how they would they have privates kind of sit at the edges of cliffs and shoot sharks in the water, so people could go down there and perform their duties. And but it was his first foray really into getting a formal education in engineering. After he completed that, he went on to start developing components for aircraft. He did work on the S3 Sentry program, so that was one of his first projects that I'm aware of. A lot of that he wasn't allowed to talk about. And then he went into the private sector, and RCA was probably one of the largest employers of former military engineers. I think David Sarnoff was a brigadier general, and he was, chiefly in charge of RCA, especially all of the early development of more experimental electronics, which fell into my grandfather's wheelhouse. And he ended up working at the Sarnoff Research Center, where he developed the insulated FM radio antenna. That was one of his inventions. And he installed the very first one he installed on the Empire State Building. So that big spear on top of the Empire State Building, that's my grandfather's antenna.
Is that right?
Yeah. And before that, it's actually kind of interesting because you think about, how FM signals really weren't popular before then because they would ice over. You couldn't put them on very tall structures or on mountains because they'd ice over and they'd stop working. So he figured out a way to insulate them so they could operate in in higher environments where there were competing radio signals as well. So it really helped kind of revolutionize the radio industry post development of that. And you look after the 1950s, like FM radio shot up like crazy. But that was kind of my first foray into electronic music because around the same time, Grandpa worked with, I think his name was Olson. And looking at my notes here, um, Sarnoff actually hired like a couple of people to work on a experimental musical instrument division, and they developed something called the RCA Synthesizer One. And around that time, I remember talking with my grandfather about it when I started college because that was actually my first major was the business of music and technology. And I had always been very interested in creating electronic circuits and how they produce sound. And then the coming across the RCA Synthesizer One project, it was really interesting that they chose it as that name. Like the term synthesizer did not exist before that RCA project. Like there were a lot of early experimentations in electronic music. I think it goes way back, like early experiments in electricity. Someone had invented an instrument that would relay electricity to bells and make the bells ring.
Mm-hmm.
Completely impractical, right? It was almost like a Rube Goldberg machine with bells and live electricity that could kill somebody. But it wasn't until like the early 20th century where people started creating electromechanical instruments.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was something called the telharmonium that was developed, I think in the late 1800s. And the concept was insane. Like you look at the tone wheels on the telharmonium, they were about the size of a small child, right? Like they had these different courses on the wheel, and the wheel would turn. They would read these magnets on the wheel, and that magnet would inform the electric signal to vibrate a certain frequency, and then you would have the tone. And this thing was massive. It took up an entire building, and they used it for a good period of time, around 20 years, until they realized that it was actually interfering with the radio signals of the local Navy. And they were like, yeah, we can't keep using this. So they shut it down. But that was really the main concept of electronic sound generation was always electromechanical. Like even if you look at early Hammond organs, right? They utilize tone wheels, which similar approach. They spin and you read the tone wheel, and the tone wheel has a specific frequency pitch to each key. But the rudiments of sound had not yet been broken down into an instrument. I thought that was really interesting about the Synthesizer One project, is it was really the first of its kind to break things down in terms of frequency, intensity. There's actually a really good forward when Sarnoff is introducing the Synthesizer Mark II, which is like their latter experiment on the project, of how the concepts of sound had never really been broken down into the base constructs, right? The rudiments of where you could generate sound with pure electricity. And that was the RCA Synthesizer 1 and 2, respectively. So
Now,
it was an interesting development.
so before we get too far into this, at that point, had you seen any of your grandfather's equipment or his home lab or anything like that?
So I grew up in Las Vegas, and my grandfather at the time lived in Maryland when I was a child, but he spent most of his life in New Jersey. He actually was a neighbor to Muhammad Ali in Cherry Hill for a little while.
Hmm.
Um, but you know, kind of closer to his latter years, he decided he was going to move to Maryland, be closer to my aunt. And my mom had decided to move away from the East Coast during the 1960s. She really didn't like the political climate or how people were their temperaments out there. She just wanted to experience California in the 60s. And so she left and really didn't come back. I didn't have a lot of opportunities to hang out with my grandfather, talk with him, but we did take that trip when I was 8, and that was like a life-changing trip. We drove. My dad got a Plymouth minivan. He had a significant amount of time off of work that he had saved up. My mom had just gotten her degree, and wasn't working yet, so we took about 3 weeks off and we just drove around country. And we stopped in Maryland for like a couple of weeks. Actually, I think it was like a week and a half. We just stayed there. And, Maryland for me as an 8-year old was might as well have been Mars, right? Like every summer I've experienced in Las Vegas was just terrible. It's kind of like the opposite. Here in winter it's bad. There in summer it's bad. So it was weird going outside and actually enjoying the weather. It's the first time I saw fireflies, but um, I didn't really interact with my grandfather all that much. But I remember when we were staying with him, I just clicked with him automatically, and he really took a liking to me. And he had this great workshop in his basement, where he was just constantly tinkering with things. He was a woodworker in his retirement. He also had he worked on photo development, but he also had this really awesome kind of like workbench where he had all these components lined up. And he showed me some of the how you would build circuit boards and how you would solder things together, and how you could connect simple components. We built a little theremin, actually, which is another very simple musical instrument, and just existed. It was a couple of light emitting diodes that you could move your hands over, and one would control pitch, one would control volume. And that was a really simple afternoon project for us, but I thought it was really fun. Just kind of sit down, experiment with how music and sound was generated. And that was really the first time he and I kind of hung out, and I had an opportunity to kind of see how his mind works.
Hmm.
Turned out it was a lot like mine. And ever since then, we just started corresponding with letters. I'd write to him, he'd write to me, and we just exchange ideas.
Okay. So back to where you've discovered synthesizers.
Mhm.
How did your musical training progress from there?
Well, so I was taking courses in college to become a audio engineer. Like
Hmm.
my experience in music, like one of the things about synthesizers is that they've always been prohibitively expensive for me. They might as well have been built out of unobtainium, because actual synthesizers made out of analog components are really pricey and they're hard to come by. Especially in Las Vegas at the time, it was a big performance town. You could buy guitars, basses, drums, all those things were widely available. You go to a pawn shop and find them right away. But synthesizers were something that you really had to dig for. And the only opportunity I really had to play with them was when I went into college. They had this course that you could take for music engineering, and at the College of Southern Nevada. It was run by this guy who was just a very cranky human being, is the best way I could describe him. But he had a very well stocked musical department. It was right there at the end of um, the tape. industry, right? Like when you would record the tape and everything was going to analog digital, and you would use Pro Tools and did digital audio workstations for everything. So he had like a lot of really cool equipment lined out, and part of that equipment were old synthesizers. And I remember sitting down with them and really enjoying how they developed. And around that same time, I was also really into industrial music. Um, it's a genre of music that uses synthesizers heavily. Is arguably one of the first genres of music that use synthesizers, um, along with other conventional instruments to build a kind of like a cold and mechanical genre. You know, you listen to industrial music; it's very heavy, it's very dystopian, it's got uh, a lot of interesting symbology in it. But I remember listening to those albums when I was younger. Like Nine Inch Nails was a big influence on me. I remember hearing Head Like a Hole on the radio, off of his album. It was like the Pretty Hate Machine, and that would nothing sounded like that on the radio at the time. It spoke to me. It was crude, it was electronic, it reminded me a lot of the sounds you would hear in science fiction, which I would later on come to find that those were also generated on synthesizers or electronic components. And I also thought it was interesting because he did all of the sounds himself on that album too. A lot of people don't talk about that. It's like he was the only member of Nine Inch Nails when it started, and he actually made that album kind of the same way I did when I was getting introduced to synthesizers. He worked as a janitor at a studio. He cleaned toilets so he could get studio time, and record that album. So I really geeked out about that. I always thought it was interesting because a lot of musicians I played with around that time didn't share my musical tastes at all. So I was really just fitting the role. One of the main reasons why I like playing bass is you can play in any band, really. The joke is like, hey dad, I want to take bass lessons. Okay, go. It's like, did you learn anything? Yeah, I learned all the notes on the first string. Okay, go again tomorrow. Oh, yeah, I learned all the notes on the second string. Come back. Okay, well, what are you going to learn the third day? It's like, what do you mean the third day? I already got a gig. That's the joke about a bass player. But that was true. Like I could play in any band. It was mostly metal outfits and not big gear heads and metal. So industrial music and getting into audio engineering was really a good way for me to scratch that itch. And I met my wife while digging into industrial music. It's very hard to find people with common interests.
Mm-hmm.
And around that time, I was kind of looking at message boards like Yahoo specifically had this great industrial music message board. And I started talking with this person, and she turned out to be from Las Vegas, went to the same high school as me. And it's like, oh, great. And she's my wife now. We've been married for, geez, coming up on 14 years, but we've known each other for well over 20.
Very good. So I know that by profession, you went the software engineering route. What did you do in college? I mean, there must have been more exposure that you had to music and synthesizers along the way.
Yeah. I mean, it was I remember it was just a point of fascination for me. So I would geek out about these albums that I was listening to, like
Hmm.
what equipment were they using? Because that at that point I started breaking down sound engineering and like not just the instruments that they use, but the methods of recording, the different pieces of equipment that you would run through the signal path to impart character into the sound.
Hmm.
And I began to realize that a lot of synthesizers had very characteristic sounds to them. Like there was this everyone knows about Moog. If you know about synthesizers, you know about Moog. He was probably he wasn't the originator of the idea of voltage controlled synthesis, but he took the concepts of the RCA synthesizer Mark II project and breaking down sound into its rudiments in a purely electronic form. And there was another engineer at the same time, Boda, who engineered electronic organs around the same time in Germany. And he introduced that concept of controlled voltage. But Moog was the first person to really expand on it musically. Like he created components that actually had musical character. Like he before Moog, there was this idea of changing the timbre in synthesis, where you would pass it through a filter. And filters are just basically a way of controlling frequencies on a spectrum and how you allow them to come out. But they were always really cold, right? Like it would just sound like a muted trumpet, or you're talking into your hand, right? It would just be muffled, not really exciting, not a
Hmm.
lot of harmonic content.
Hmm.
So Moog designs this thing called a diode ladder filter, which to some degree imparted distortion into the signal. And that distortion added harmonics and it made the sound more characteristic. And that appealed to musicians. So you start seeing after Moog all these other companies start to develop instruments and use them on albums. Like they would have sales reps and people go out and say, "Hey, you can put this on your album," and you would only hear them on major recordings. But I listened out for those. I was listening for the weird sounds
Hmm.
being generated on these albums as I was trying to break them down in terms of musical production. And I really started geeking out about like the engineering notes, because you can actually go into a lot of albums and you open up the album liner notes and they'll tell you what equipment they use, like the Human League, which was a big synth pop band
Hmm.
in the 80s. They had notes on the equipment that they used at the time for developing that album. And you could also go into the engineer's notebook and see like what it was, how they put things together, how they made everything work together. Because that's the other thing to keep in mind about synthesis. Like in its early days and early development, nothing played together. Nothing actually like you couldn't take a Buchla synthesizer, which was like a West Coast synth, and a Moog synthesizer, which was an East Coast synth, and get the modules to talk together. They just would not work. They used different voltages, different ways of connecting the signal path. There was no standard. And it took a long time for a standard to kind of get developed in music. So you hear all these different techniques and approaches towards incorporating electronic instruments in film and in albums, and you start to realize that, oh, all these instruments had very unique characteristics to them, and that all was built around the design of these components. So my exposure to synthesizers was really a lot of research and digging into albums and kind of expanding my approach to music.
Now,
Uh,
now this sounds like personal research. Was this part of the formal curriculum?
oh yeah, so that guy was just a very cranky guy.
Hmm.
I remember I've always had a problem being the guy who has all the answers. Like he'd ask a question, I'd raise my hand, and he'd like, what's compression? I'd answer what's compression. He started to get like this attitude towards me where it's like you're kind of a know-it-all, and I appreciated that. Actually, I thought that was interesting. But around the time I discovered the RCA synthesizer Mark II And I found out my grandfather was he was contemporary to Olson. They worked in the same department. I talked with my grandpa about it. It's like, did you work on that project at all? It's like, not personally. He didn't work on it himself, but he was. It's kind of like us in a software engineering job, right? Like
Hmm.
you have one guy working on a project over here, you're working on your own project. That guy's like, hey, you're really good with React. Can you show me how to build out the front end for my project?
Hmm.
And that was kind of what was happening at RCA. I remember I asked my dad, my grandpa, like, how did you what did you contribute to that project? It's like, well, part of the fun was trying to get the thing to work without exhausting the world's supply of vacuum tubes because it was huge. It was like the size of a room. And it wasn't exactly a practical instrument either. But I had thought about this, and it's like, of course, this had to be the first synthesizer. My grandfather invented it, so I was going to go to this guy and I was going to brag, and he shot me down right away. It's like, actually, the development of electronic instruments predates that, and he starts talking about like the Ondes Martinal, which was the first electronic instrument with keyboard. That's a novel concept, right? Like we think about um, how do we interface, how do we interact with these instruments, and the RCA synthesizer Mark II didn't even have a manual, like a keyboard manual, the black and white keys. It had a typewriter, and you would punch it would use this. It utilized the same technology as player pianos. It would just suck air in, and that air would move a mallet open and close like a gate,
Hmm.
and it would control different parameters. So the thing was an absolute bastard to program, and your common musician didn't know how to approach it. In fact, it was only used in about 5 recordings that I'm aware of. But he strongly encouraged me to start researching how synthesizers functioned and how they were used in music. And I had another professor that was really big into the history of music, and he knew I was into industrial as well. Dr. Moreau, like the island of Dr. Moreau.
Hmm.
He was um, probably one of my favorite professors, but he had
And
this really great
that was
library.
really his name, Dr.
Yeah,
Moreau.
Dr. Moreau. He was the funniest guy. He was really cool. Like the opposite of that other guy. I don't even remember his name. But he had this really expansive MP3 library. This is back when they had they didn't have thumb drives. He gave me a zip disk with like a
Okay.
bunch of MP3s of different bands to check out. And I would bounce between those MP3s and the head of the engineering department there at the college and just kind of go around like, hey, how did they make this sound? How did they make this sound?
Hmm.
And you begin to develop the methodologies of approaching synthesis and sound design specifically. And then around that time, also, you had to take these electives to get the degree. So I had to take a certain number of electronic engineering classes, and those were fun too because again, like I kind of benefit from being a millennial. I have one foot in the analog age, one foot in the digital age.
Hmm.
So there were a lot of digital components that were introduced, but I also got to take classes from people who worked on old analog circuitry. Like there was one of my professors said that his first job was testing LEDs on a relay system. Like there were these relay buses that ran machinery, and they had like a array of LEDs that would show you if the machine was functioning or not.
Hmm. Hmm.
And every day you'd have to go in and test every single one of those LEDs until someone came up with the bright idea. Let's put a button on the front panel that just lights them all up. So you could see right away if they were on or not. So I don't know. I thought that was in terms of my education, I did receive a lot of information about circuit design, what those circuits were made up of. I don't keep it in active memory anymore, but I used to be able to tell you the algorithm about, how to measure the cutoff frequency of a low pass filter, right? Like I could tell you what components were used to create a low pass filter, how you would amplify it, and it was something I geeked out about a lot because I always felt like the filters and the instrument were a big part of how it gained its characteristics. Like it was the difference between a ARP synthesizer or ARP synthesizer and a Moog.
Okay.
But yeah, it was a great time.
So at some point you switched to software engineering
Mm-hmm.
and you had begun to notice parallels in the way that software engineering disciplines were evolving and the way that synthesizers had evolved. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I didn't notice that until very recently, which is actually kind of funny when you think about like the evolution of synthesizers as an instrument, how they became a commodity. Um, like they didn't have an established standard that worked across the entire industry. In the 1970s, they developed these things called the 500 series, which were modular components that had to adhere to a standard power supply, standard size, standard input output. Everything had to operate around a standard. So different manufacturers could build these components and they would all work within the 500 series standard. That did not exist in synthesis at all. Like the very first standard, I guess you could say, is MIDI, like is a way of sending digital information between instruments, and it had like a standard codex of how MIDI was interpreted across those instruments. That was 1982 when that was developed. And everything before then, if you wanted to sync things, if you wanted to program things, you had to work with differing voltages, you had to work with different sync methods. Um, Roland had this musical computer that you could create sequences with. It was almost like a rudimentary digital audio workstation bus where you could program in the control voltage and gate for each note. And it had no backup. You could back it up your sounds to tape, and then you play that tape back up right back into the machine to verify it. And if you wanted to send a sync to another device like a drum machine, right? Drum machines had a different way of syncing with each other. So the tempo sync from this musical computer may cause the drum machine to go super crazy, right? Like it creates, it might be pulse synced, whereas the other one is maybe data synced, and they don't kind of lock in with each other. So you had to use all these different workarounds and methods to get everything to sync and work together. If you wanted to control different components, you had to figure out different ways of converting the voltage. You had modulators everywhere. It was a real mess to get everything to work within a standard. And then there was this company around 1995, Dope Pure, came up with a standard called the Euro Rack standard, which was a standard voltage, standard input output. Your jacks were the same. Everything had to apply within the standard. So different companies could make these different modules to work with each other. Like you have a company like over here that's building components and a company over here that's building their own components. You want them to play together nicely within the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
That modular design and interoperability really is the current state of software, right? When we talk about microservices utilizing rest and different ways of communicating between programs. These are all standards that established in software over the course of time of software being applied within a particular industry. And the same thing goes with synthesis. When you think about like when it was first commercially available in the 60s, right? To where it is now, the standard evolved out of its application, right? Like it wasn't exactly like, oh, this is just how synthesizers work, right? You had to apply them in a variety of use cases before the standard evolved into a commodity. And I do credit the Japanese a lot with pushing synthesizers into that standard. Um, because, I mean, you look at Japan post World War II, right? Year zero, they were forced to build everything from nothing. So they prioritized their entire population to focus on innovation, engineering, sciences. They really made a lot of investments on trying to build up their economy and their infrastructure again. And before the Japanese started getting into the synthesizer market, synthesizers were prohibitively expensive. You could not afford them. If you were a big name act like the Who, right? Like Don't Get Fooled Again, the opening sound is like this guy, Pete Townsend playing his guitar through a synthesizer.
Mhm.
Um, but and you would hear it on Led Zeppelin albums, or the Beatles used a Moog modular, not knowing how to program the damn thing on Here Comes the Sun. That's a good example where you can hear early synthesizers. But there was this ad that was placed in a popular magazine around that time that said, if you can afford a truck, you can afford a synthesizer. And that is how much they cost. But then, like you started seeing competitors in the European market kind of get into the market, like Kumar and Kurzweil, a lot of in Italy, right? Like Italy was probably in the 1960s um, a European version of Japan, right? They were manufacturing cheaper instruments that people could afford as musicians. Um, and then Japan started working with smaller components to make an export commodity more viable, right? So you ended up with integrated circuits, transistors, different components that made the synthesizers smaller and easier to obtain, cheaper overall. And a lot of that had to do with their approach towards engineering and commoditization of a product. Before that, you did not see synthesizers applied in music or film very frequently. So you have more users, right? You have a greater ecosystem of developers working within the system, evolving it into a standard. Then you also look at the commercial applications of synthesizers, right? It started being used heavily in film scoring, right? Like Wendy Carlos is a great example of a early synthesis. She had a double major. She majored in music and in physics. She designed her first computer when she was 14 years old. Just a genius of a human being. But she was the first person to really build a album. I think it was Switched on Bach, that utilized the Moog exclusively. And then she started working on film scores like a Clockwork Orange, a lot of Kubrick films. But then there was this really ambitious project that she did, I think, the Tron soundtrack. And that was a unique challenge, right? Because she had to work with synthesizers as well as an orchestra. That didn't exist before then. It was like 1981, right? 81
Mhm.
or 82
Yep.
when when Tron came out, and she had to develop the soundtrack using the electronic components of the day, like including like a very rudimentary musical computer, backing things up on a really constrained budget, and trying to get these synthesizers to play well with an orchestra at different places of recording, right? Like it was recorded all over the world. And that was a unique challenge because there wasn't really a great way of getting the components, the instruments that she was using to sync absolutely with like a click track, right? You had to slow things down and speed things up. And that really pushed the development of MIDI as a standard for setting clock times. But then as synthesizer components became more compartmentalized and more digital, right? Like you see synthesizers becoming more digital during the 1980s just because it was easier cheaper to mass produce them, and you had to expand on the concept of what an individual circuit was because early synthesizers were monophonic or duophonic, right? Like it was one sound generation per key, and you couldn't play more than one sound. So the concept of polyphony really made it so you had to take these individual sound cards, right? Each one was a synthesizer. You have to assign it to each one of the keys. And doing that in an analog space was really expensive. So how are you going to do all this without standards, right? How are you going to build the same sound card over and over and over again for a production model polyphonic synthesizer unless you have applied standards to the components and voltages of how those cards are built? And software does the same thing. The standards that we have in software engineering echo the environment of how software engineering is applied. And you see the same thing in synthesis. It starts off with an insane invention of electromechanical engineering that interferes with other radio signals. And now we're in a state where you can run a synthesizer in the browser. I wrote a program. It was completely client side, which was a synthesizer using the web audio interface. And you can take all those rudiments from the original synthesizer project. You can use oscillators, amplifiers, filters right there in the web interface, and you can program them together in a fixed path to create a synthesizer. And thinking back with my dad, my grandpa's early concepts of, how do I get this thing to work without exhausting the world's supply of vacuum tubes? Now it's just, I can write a simple client-side project in a single JavaScript file, and bang, it's there. You have a synthesizer. And it's really easy to kind of start too, right? It gives you a standardization, a framework to approach the problem. Yeah, you definitely see a lot of parallels between synthesis and software engineering.
So where's electronic music going then, specifically synthesizers?
It's very interesting right now. It's the entry point of obtaining a synthesizer is it is easier to get in than it ever was. So there is this company right now. It's called Behringer. It's a German company, but they own factories in China that manufacture the electronic components for a lot of musical gear. Like whether or not it is a Behringer brand, effect pedal, compressor, rack unit, or whatever, it's probably using a Behringer component. They are responsible for manufacturing, capacitors, resistors, integrated circuits, diodes, and they do it very well and very cheaply within exact tolerances. So the guy who started that company is like, you know what? What if I just started making musical equipment? because my components are being used in all of these different pieces of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
So why not? I'll do it and I'll focus on making it as cheap as possible. And they started off with these little effect pedals, right? Like if you're not familiar with it, it's a great way to approximate the sound of a synthesizer, right? You plug your instrument into the pedal, it affects it in some sort of way, and then it outputs the affected sound. And they were expensive. Effects pedals were always expensive in like the early 90s. Same thing with synthesizers. The components, it's not a big market. The components are hard to source from reputable manufacturers within a tolerance. So Behringer's like, yeah, I'll start producing these copies of another popular brand, which is a Roland brand. They called Boss pedals, right? So they just started making copies of Boss pedals, like one for one. And they put them in cheaper plastic enclosures and sell them for like $20. It was insane, like how attainable that made uh, equipment. But musicians being stupid ultimately. They were like, oh no, I'm not gonna. That's only $20. I'm gonna use this thing that's $300. It's like, okay, well, it's technically the same thing. It's manufactured from the same components, made from the same parts. And that was the case. Behringer was a joke for a really long time until he decided, you know what? I'm going to start building synthesizers. And that's a relatively recent development because, musicians like me who grew up listening to albums that had specific instruments on them, like, the ARP 2600 is a freaking amazing instrument, like in terms of its tone quality and its sound design. It's a semi-modular principle, so you can use the fixed signal path or patch things together, and it just sounds incredible. But these things might as well be made of gold, right? Like they don't make them anymore. They only manufactured them in the 70s. The company's out of business. If you buy one, you have to buy it secondhand. Who knows how well it's maintained, right? Like vintage gear is always kind of iffy.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have it serviced, and you're looking at an instrument that may require like a 8,000, 9,000, $10,000 investment. Um, so Behringer comes in, he's like, you know what? I'm going to recreate the ARP 2600, and it's going to be $600. Made out of new components, manufactured off my line using the components I manufacture in my factories. And he's done this with numerous instruments that are really kind of like fabled in terms of sound design. Like
Mm-hmm.
he's done copies of the Mini Moog, he's done copies of the Wasp, he's done copies of uh, damn near anything that you can imagine. He also manufactures synthesizer modules in the Eurorack format. And modular synthesis is one of those lofty areas of synthesis. It's very difficult to program, but you can create some really awesome sounds with it. And that's always been difficult to get into. It's super expensive. Like old synthesizer systems, you're talking about, like, again, 6,000, 7,000, $10,000, right? Like you are breaking the bank getting in there. And it's usually only big artists, big musicians that have the ability to break into that. They Behringer did a reproduction model of the System 500, which was the Moog system that Wendy Carlos used to record Switched on Bach. That system is retailed now, I think, at like $1,200. Back in the day, that Moog system would have been like buying a car. It would have been, if you adjusted the price, it would have been around $50,000. So you're seeing these instruments become more attainable. They fit within the standard of music today, right? So everything plays together. which it didn't do before. So I think now synthesizers are becoming more widely applicable in music, and they've been there forever now. Like if you've listened to music between from the 1980s and then some, you can't escape them. Like they've reached a degree of fidelity in sound design that is nearly um, it's impossible to tell the difference between that and in an actual physical instrument, right? Like you can create these really dramatic swells, swells with PCM modeling now, which is again, it's not sampled. It's pure synthesis. You're taking the rudiments of sound, you're evolving them out, and you can create these really great instruments. But a good example of how they've kind of evolved into their own sound that is particularly desired is, I guess, the Terminator 2 soundtrack.
Okay, we had a little snafu there. Gunnar mentioned Terminator 2, and I think Skynet decided it didn't like us, so it interfered with one of our internet connections here. You were about to talk about some of the audio used in Terminator 2.
Yeah. So it was the same, I think his name is Fidel, same composer Terminator 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Terminator 1, you listen to that soundtrack, and it's entirely synthesis, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
was done live because again, it predates all those standards, right? He had all these instruments that he was playing, and he had to sync it up live and make sure that the drum machine, drum sequences match the instruments. So he has this opportunity to revisit the score, right? To kind of take the same motifs that he established in the original film and put them in the new film. And he has quite a bit more budget. There's standards now. This was like the early 90s, so there are ways of syncing things up. But he decides, you know what, to hell with all the standards. I'm going to do things the old school way, and he started using this synthesizer called the Fairlight. And you actually see it in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? Which is funny because those things cost like 100 grand. They are not cheap. They use a mainframe system with a bunch of preloaded sound cards. Um, and it was the first time you worked with audio samples, right? So you had a single audio sample, and you could. The cool thing about the Fairlight, it had like this big CRT monitor, and you had like a keyboard that you could punch in and program the mainframe with, but you also had the keyboard that you play the sounds on. And the Fairlight came with like a bunch of different sound samples of different instruments. But the way that it would pitch the sound samples is it would speed them up or slow them down, right? So that actually became part of the feature of the Fairlight. Like if you listen to it, the sound is like on lower registers, completely incomprehensible from the standard range of which it was recorded. Um, so when you hear the strings, when you hear the horns, when you hear all these different motifs in Terminator 2, they're actually pitched down versions of the sound samples. And the way that he utilized them in the film was different sound samples within the Fairlight were designated to different characters, right? Like if you
Hmm.
listen to like when the different Terminators are in there, they just use different sound samples to denote that character. And what's interesting about that is was a very big cinematic soundscape, right? Compared to other soundtracks that existed before. I mean, there were synthesizer soundtracks. Escape from New York is a great one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that's like stripped down, invokes a lot of memories, right? Like you think about 1980s cheesy synth soundtracks, they're really rudimentary. They have very few parts in them. And when you listen to most of the another area of sound design I studied in school was film. They had these two concepts. There was something that was diegetic and metadiegetic. Metadiegetic meant like it's just the score, right? Like these are the sounds that you hear as part of the film, right? Like usually the score accompanies the dialogue or the sequences of things that are going on in the film. But early days of synthesis, they were very simplistic. Now, Wendy Carlos' Tron soundtrack was a departure from that, right? It was this big cinematic thing. It was
Mm-hmm.
incorporation of these different synthesizers and parts and melodies that was orchestrated by a genius. And then you look at John Carpenter films, and John Carpenter is John Carpenter, right? Like he did all the soundtracks himself with assistance from an engineer. Terminator 2 was a big cinematic score, but it incorporated elements in terms of the diegesis of the story, right? Like the characters themselves were announced by different instrument parts, almost like Peter and the Wolf, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you have this diegesis of the instruments playing the characters. And in Terminator 2, it was the very first soundtrack where you couldn't tell the difference between the score and the sound effects, right? Like they were combined, but in such a way that utilized the restrictions of technology to achieve the effect, right? Because even though you could, and you do hear in modern music, these very pristine samples of like orchestral swells and string sections and all these different organic models of drums, and you can't tell if it's real or not. You go back and you listen to the character that's imparted by the application of that circuit or how the sound is designed, and that's where the character comes from, right? Like that's what makes it interesting. Is to me, synthesizers are an art form. They are a way of imparting a musicality that doesn't exist in nature. It is the sound of electricity. There's no transducing it. There are no mechanical restrictions on how it's generated. It is pure electricity broken down in the rudiments of how we hear sound and how that sound affects us psychologically. Um, and I think that's what really appeals to me now is you start hearing musicians incorporate these big sounds. Like I guess a few years ago there used to be this genre of music called dubstep, which was like let's make synthesizers freak out. Like it will make all these random sounds, all these different wobbles and warbles and pitch swells, and just it did not sound like music to me, which is funny because I love industrial music, and a lot of people would say, like, I remember I was listening to an industrial album once. My dad walks in, he's like, Gunnar, this tape is but so it's a matter of opinion. But now the incorporation of synthesizers is trying to go back into those days of like the 1980s. Stranger Things is a good example, right?
Sure.
Stranger Things builds on the concept of John Carpenter's approach to film scoring with synthesizers. It breaks things down into very rudimentary elements. You maybe hear two parts in a single sound. And then when you have these big areas of metadiegesis, right? Like the areas that need to fill up emotion and psychology, that's where more instruments come in, right? Because it is the restriction of utilizing synthesizers is the fact that early on they didn't talk together very effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Making more parts with more synthesizers was just a pain in the ass. It took a lot of time. So in John Carpenter films, you hear like very simple, like, one or two parts going on in the metadiegesis until a big event comes. And then it's like, okay, let's do seven parts. And it makes those seven because you spend most of the film just listening to the two parts. The fact that there are seven parts in the composition makes that composition sound a lot bigger, right? Because comparatively, uh, it is, right? Like other parts in the film are smaller. So I think it's really interesting that people are going back and being nostalgic about these circuits, and you can buy them very cheaply. I can go out, 500 bucks, buy a synthesizer. That's amazing to me. Like when I was a kid, I would go to pawn shops every once in a while. I'd see something. I bought a Yamaha TX81Z from a pawn shop once when I was 16, and I geeked out about that because it used the same chips as the Sega Genesis. And that's a lot of things. That's something that a lot of people don't realize. To some degree, you've owned a synthesizer without realizing it. They were in game consoles back in the day. Nintendo had its own sound generation card. Sega Genesis did too. And a lot of these components, because again, like the Japanese were really good at manufacturing things, they were reusable, not just modular in terms of how they were applied in sound design, but modular in the way that they were applied in commercial applications, right? You had one factory that was making the sound chips for Yamaha synthesizers that was also making the sound chips as the Sega Genesis. And even though like that synthesizer was a huge pain in the ass to program, I mean, it was a pain to program. You had two buttons and you had to navigate the interface there, and it utilized a form of synthesis called frequency modulation, um, which is there's all different ways of generating sound, but it was basically just a bunch of sine waves modulating each other to create a complex waveform. You can imagine programming that on a little push button thing from the 1990s. But it did make the sounds of the Sega Genesis. And I had one of those when I was a little kid. And it was like, wow, that's the sound. That's the tone. It's amazing.
Very good. Well, Gunnar, thank you for coming back to the show. This has been very enlightening for me. It was good to have you back.
Yeah, it's great talking about these things. I really appreciate getting the idea out there. I'm hoping to bring the parallels between software engineering and synthesis manufacturing, essentially. There are so many key points where they sync up today
Hmm.
in terms of how they're applied in the industry and how you can get them and how that's expanded the capabilities that we have as musicians of obtaining them and contributing back into that standard. So I think it'd be really interesting to get people interested in, um, I guess, tangential engineering, right? Like just because
Hmm.
we're software engineers doesn't mean we can't apply concepts and standards from other engineering disciplines into what we do.
Indeed. Thank you again. This has been
Yeah, no
fun.
problem.
Thank you all for watching today's show. Let's do this again soon. Take care.